Hey guys, how are you all? Hope you all are fine and relaxing right now, cause it's time for Reddit stories with Minecraft gameplay. I ruined my ex-husband's life. The day I found the burner phone hidden inside a hollowed-out copy of a pre-law textbook, I didn't scream and I didn't cry. I just sat on the edge of our king-sized bed, feeling the weight of the device in my palm, and realized that the last 12 years of my life had been a carefully constructed lie. Mark was downstairs, probably making that organic fair trade coffee he loved so much, blissfully unaware that the foundation of our perfect suburban life had just developed a terminal crack. People always ask how you can live with someone for over a decade and not know who they really are. But the truth is, you only see what they want you to see, and Mark was an absolute master of curation. We were the power couple of our social circle in North Raleigh. He was a high-flying corporate consultant with a penchant for expensive watches and a smile that could sell ice to an Alaskan. And I was the supportive, equally successful interior designer who kept our home looking like a spread from Architectural Digest. We had the golden retriever, the Tesla in the driveway, and the annual trips to the Amalfi Coast. On paper, my life was a dream. But as I stared at the glowing screen of that cheap flip phone, I realized I'd been living in a psychological thriller that was only just beginning its first act. The first message I read wasn't even romantic. It was clinical. It was a series of bank account numbers and wire transfer confirmations, none of which matched our joint accounts or Mark's business filings. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a simple affair. If Mark was cheating, he was cheating with a spreadsheet, and that was somehow much more terrifying. I spent the next 3 hours, while he was at his weekend cycling club meeting, scrolling through months of data. It wasn't just another woman, although there were a few of those too, categorized by city and rate. It was a systematic siphoning of our wealth, my inheritance, and even the college fund we'd set up for a child we hadn't even had yet. When Mark came home, smelling of sweat and expensive spandex, he kissed my forehead like he always did. He asked what was for dinner, his voice light and carefree, and for a split second, I wondered if I could just pretend I hadn't seen it. I wondered if I could go back to being the happy, oblivious wife, because the alternative was a descent into a reality I wasn't sure I could survive. But then he mentioned how we should probably scale back on the kitchen remodel because the market was looking lean, and something inside me just snapped. He wasn't just stealing from our future. He was gaslighting me about our present while standing in the house my hard work had paid for. I didn't confront him that night. I've always been a bit of a strategist, a trait that Mark used to praise me for when it came to business. I realized that if I blew up then and there, he'd have his bags packed and those offshore accounts drained before I could even find a lawyer. Instead, I smiled, told him I'd order Thai food, and spent the evening watching Netflix with him while my mind was busy calculating the trajectory of his total destruction. It's a strange feeling, sitting next to the person you love most in the world, while simultaneously deciding exactly how you're going to dismantle their entire existence. Over the next few weeks, I became a ghost in my own life. I started documenting everything. Every late night, work call, every suspicious credit card charge that I'd previously ignored, and every time he lied about where he was going. I hired a private investigator named Elias, a man who looked more like a tired high school geography teacher than a guy who catches cheating husbands for a living. Elias was the one who found the real dirt. It wasn't just the money or the casual flings. Mark was involved in a series of shell companies that were essentially laundering money for a local construction firm involved in some very shady city contracts. The more I learned, the more I realized that Mark hadn't just been unfaithful. He'd been using our marriage as a front for a level of white-collar criminality that would make a mob boss blush. He'd used my name on some of the filings, thinking I was too busy picking out backsplash tiles to notice the fine print of the investment opportunities he'd had me sign. He was setting me up to be his fall girl if the house of cards ever came tumbling down. That realization was the final nail in the coffin of my mercy. I wasn't just going to leave him. I was going to ensure that when he fell, there wouldn't be a single person left to catch him. I started small. I began moving my own personal assets into accounts he couldn't touch, slowly and methodically, making it look like I was just overspending on business expenses for my design firm. I played the part of the slightly ditzy, shopaholic wife to perfection. Mark, in his infinite arrogance, found it endearing. He liked that I was distracted. It made his own maneuvers easier, or so he thought. He He started getting bolder, bringing his associates over to the house for drinks. Men who wore suits that cost more than my first car, but had eyes that looked like they'd seen things no one should see. I would serve them drinks and hors d'oeuvres, playing the perfect hostess while secretly recording their conversations on a device hidden in a decorative vase. I listened to them discuss kickbacks, bribing city officials, and how they were going to liquidate certain assets before the next audit. Mark was the architect of the whole scheme, the clean face of a very dirty operation. He looked so confident sitting there in his designer armchair, sipping 20-year-old scotch, thinking he was the smartest man in every room he entered. He had no idea that the woman he called sweetheart was building a dossier that would eventually end up on the desk of the district attorney. The hardest part was the intimacy. Having to sleep next to him, to let him touch me, knowing what I knew, was a form of psychological torture I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. Every time he told me he loved me, I felt a physical wave of nausea. But I stayed. I waited. I needed one more piece of evidence, something that linked him directly to the primary fraud at the city council level. It came during our 12-year anniversary dinner at the most expensive steakhouse in the city. Mark was feeling celebratory. He'd just closed a major deal, and he'd had a bit too much to drink. He started bragging about how protected we were, how he'd made sure that even if things went south, we'd be sitting pretty in a country with no extradition. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of red wine and ego, and whispered that he'd tucked away a nest egg in my name that even I didn't know about. He thought he was telling me he'd secured our future. What he was actually telling me was where he'd hidden the smoking gun. He'd used a trust in my maiden name to hide the largest portion of the embezzled funds, thinking that because I never used that name anymore, it would go unnoticed. That night, after he fell into a deep, drunken sleep, I found the documents in his home office safe. I'd spent months watching him enter the code, memorizing the finger movements until I could do it in my sleep. Seeing my maiden name on those documents, attached to millions of dollars of stolen money, made my blood run cold. He hadn't just been stealing, he had been burying me. If the authorities found this, I'd be the one going to prison while he disappeared to a beach in South America. The betrayal was so complete, so absolute, that any lingering doubt I had about ruining him vanished instantly. The next morning, I didn't make breakfast. I didn't wish him a good day at work. I waited until he left. Then I called Elias and told him we had everything. I also called a lawyer who specialized in complicated divorces, a woman named Sarah who had a reputation for being a shark in a Chanel suit. When I sat down in her office and laid out the spreadsheets, the recordings, and the trust documents, she looked at me with a mixture of pity and genuine respect. She told me that I wasn't just looking at a divorce. I was looking at a federal investigation. She asked me if I was ready for the fallout, because once we pulled this thread, the whole world was going to see Mark for exactly what he was. I told her I'd never been more ready for anything in my life. I wasn't just doing this for the money he stole or the lies he told. I was doing it for the version of myself that had believed in him. The woman who had spent 12 years building a life with a man who viewed her as nothing more than a legal shield. I spent the rest of the week packing a small bag and moving it to a secure apartment Sarah had helped me find. I didn't take much, just the essentials and the things that actually belonged to me. The rest of it, the furniture, the art, the memories, could all burn with him. The day I served him the papers, I wasn't even there. I was sitting in a small cafe 3 towns over, watching the news. I'd made sure the filing was public and that certain interested parties in the media were tipped off about the nature of the financial irregularities mentioned in the petition. By the time Mark walked out of his office that afternoon, he wasn't just being sued for divorce. He was being swarmed by reporters and greeted by 2 plainclothes detectives who had a lot of questions about a certain trust fund in my maiden name. I turned off my phone and took a sip of my coffee. The sun was shining, the air felt crisp, and for the first time in over a decade, I felt like I could actually breathe. I knew the road ahead would be long and ugly. I knew there would be depositions, court dates, and a whole lot of people wondering how I could do that to my husband. But they didn't know the Mark I knew. They didn't see the man who was willing to let his wife go to prison for his own greed. As I sat there, watching the world go by, I realized that I hadn't ruined his life. He had ruined it himself. I just stopped helping him hide the wreckage. The fallout from the initial filing was like watching a controlled demolition in slow motion. Mark's first instinct, predictably, was to try and charm his way out of it. He sent dozens of flowers to the apartment he didn't know I wasn't staying in, left voicemails that pivoted from tearful apologies to cold, calculated threats, and finally, he tried to play the victim to our entire social circle. He told everyone I'd had a mental break, that the stress of my business had finally gotten to me and I was hallucinating financial crimes because I couldn't handle our temporary cash flow issues. For a week, some people actually believed him. I started getting concerned texts from friends we'd known for years, asking if I needed professional help. But Mark's charm had a shelf life, especially when the FBI got involved. See, the thing about money laundering is that it leaves a digital footprint that no amount of charisma can erase. Once Sarah and I handed over the files Elias had gathered, the federal investigators didn't take long to connect the dots. The shell companies I discovered weren't just for hiding a few kickbacks. They were part of a massive racketeering scheme involving the city's infrastructure projects. Mark wasn't just a consultant. He was the bagman for a group of people who were very unhappy that their clean front was now under a federal microscope. Watching his descent from the sidelines was both terrifying and deeply satisfying. Within 2 weeks, his firm mutually agreed to let him go. His bank accounts were frozen as part of the investigation, and the Tesla he was so proud of was repossessed because he'd been using company funds to pay the lease. The power couple was officially dead, and Mark was finding out that when the money stops flowing, the friends disappear pretty quickly. He was staying in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, the same man who used to complain if the thread count of his hotel sheets was less than 800. The pressure started to mount when one of his associates, a man named Victor who I'd served baked brie to just a month prior, was arrested at the airport trying to fly to Grand Cayman. Victor didn't have Mark's sense of loyalty, or rather, his sense of self-preservation. He started talking almost immediately. He told the feds everything about the kickbacks, the bribes, and specifically, how Mark had been the one to set up the trust in my name as a safety net. Suddenly, the narrative that I was crazy fell apart. I spent 3 days in a windowless room with federal agents, explaining exactly how I found the phone and the documents. I gave them the recordings from the vase. I'll never forget the look on the lead agent's face when he listened to Mark laughing about how the little lady would never suspect a thing because she was too busy playing house. That recording was what finally cleared me of any knowing involvement. It proved I was a victim of his fraud, not a co-conspirator. But the cost was high. Because so much of our assets were tied up in the illegal schemes, almost everything we owned was seized. The house, the furniture, the investments, it was all gone. I was starting over with nothing but my business and a small savings account Mark hadn't known about. Mark, however, was facing much worse. He was indicted on 24 counts of wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. When the news broke, the ruined part of the story really began to take shape. The local papers ran his mugshot on the front page. He looked haggard, his perfect hair disheveled, the arrogance finally replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. His family, who had always looked down on me as the girl from the wrong side of the tracks, suddenly went silent. They stopped calling, stopped defending him. They were too busy trying to distance themselves from the scandal. But the real twist came about a month into the legal proceedings. Mark's lawyer approached Sarah with a settlement offer for the divorce. He wanted me to sign a non-disclosure agreement and retract my statements to the FBI in exchange for a significant sum of money he'd supposedly hidden away in a place the feds hadn't found yet. It was a classic Mark move. Try to buy your way out of trouble with more dirty money. Sarah laughed in the lawyer's face, but I saw an opportunity. I didn't want the money, but I wanted to know where it was. I told Sarah to play along, just for a bit. We let him think I was considering it, that the prospect of being broke was making me desperate. He actually called me from a payphone, his voice sounding like a ghost of the man I'd married. He told me he still loved me, that he'd done it all for us, and if I just helped him this one last time, we could disappear and start over somewhere else. Listening to him lie so effortlessly, even now, made my skin crawl. I told him I needed proof the money existed before I'd even think about signing anything. 2 days later, he sent a cryptic message through a friend, a set of coordinates and a key to a storage unit in a neighboring county. He thought he was being so clever, so cinematic. I didn't go to the storage unit. I called the FBI. When they opened it, they didn't just find cash. They found a literal mountain of evidence against the construction firm and several high-ranking city officials that Mark had been keeping as insurance in case his partners ever turned on him. By trying to bribe me, he'd handed over the one thing that would ensure he'd never see the outside of a prison cell for decades. The fallout from that discovery was a political earthquake. 3 city council members resigned within 48 hours. The CEO of the construction firm was arrested in the middle of a charity gala. And Mark was now the most hated man in the state. He wasn't just a white-collar criminal anymore. He was the rat who had brought down the whole system. The protection he'd hoped for from his associates vanished instantly, replaced by a very real fear for his life. He was moved to a high-security wing of the county jail while he awaited trial, because the associates he'd betrayed were now offering bounties on his head. I watched all of this from my new, much smaller apartment. I spent my days rebuilding my design firm, which had taken a massive hit from the scandal. Some clients left, unable to separate me from the mess, but others stayed, moved by the fact that I'd been the one to blow the whistle. I was working harder than I ever had, but for the first time, the work felt mine. No one was skimming off the top. No one was using my reputation to hide their crimes. It was exhausting, but it was honest. However, the ruining wasn't just about the law. It was about the social death he experienced. In our world, reputation was everything, and Mark's was not just tarnished, it was radioactive. I remember walking into a grocery store and seeing a group of women we used to have brunch with every Sunday. They saw me and immediately looked away, not because they hated me, but because they didn't know what to say to the woman who had destroyed a man they all thought was a pillar of the community. It was a lonely time, a period of shedding skin that I hadn't realized was so tight. The most difficult part was the depositions. Sitting across from Mark in a conference room, surrounded by lawyers, while he stared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. He didn't look like the man I'd loved anymore. He looked like a cornered animal, baring his teeth. At one point, during a break when the lawyers were out of the room, he leaned across the table and whispered, "You think you've won? You've got nothing. You're living in a box, working for pennies, while I'm still the one who made you." I looked him straight in the eye and said, "Mark, I'd rather live in a box with a clear conscience than in a mansion built on lies. And the best part? I'm the one who gets to walk out of this room. You're the one going back to a cell." The look of defeat that crossed his face in that moment was better than any settlement check I could have received. He realized then that he couldn't manipulate me anymore. The little lady was gone, and in her place was a woman who had seen the bottom of the abyss and decided to climb out. As the trial approached, the media circus intensified. Every day, there was a new headline about the Raleigh racketeering ring. My name was constantly in the press, usually framed as the scorned wife who took down an empire. It wasn't the most flattering portrayal, but I didn't care. I was focused on the end game. I was focused on the day the judge would hand down the sentence, and I could finally close this chapter of my life. But even as the walls were closing in on him, Mark had one last card to play, a final, desperate attempt to take me down with him that I never saw coming. He claimed, through a new, much more aggressive legal team, that I had been the mastermind all along. He alleged that I was the one who had set up the shell companies using my design firm as a front, and that he had only participated out of fear for his life because I was involved with dangerous people. It was a ridiculous, laughable claim, but in the world of high-stakes legal battles, even a ridiculous claim can cause a massive amount of damage if it's shouted loud enough. Suddenly, I was under investigation again. My bank records were combed over, my clients were interviewed, and my life was put back under the microscope. For a month, I lived in a state of constant anxiety. I couldn't sleep, I barely ate, and I watched as the business I'd worked so hard to rebuild started to crumble again. Mark was smiling in court now, looking smug as his lawyers spun a web of lies that made me look like a calculating femme fatale. He wanted to ruin me as thoroughly as I had ruined him. He wanted to make sure that even if he went down, I wouldn't have a life worth living. It was a battle of wills, a psychological war fought in the courtroom and the court of public opinion. And for a while, it looked like he might actually win. But Mark made one crucial mistake. He'd forgotten about the one person he'd treated even worse than me, his longtime assistant, a quiet, observant woman named Elena who had been with him for nearly a decade. Mark had always treated her like furniture, discussing his most sensitive business in front of her because he didn't think she was smart enough to understand it. He'd also been underpaying her and verbally abusing her for years. When she saw the news about his latest defense strategy, she didn't just get angry. She got even. Elena showed up at Sarah's office one afternoon with a box. Inside that box were years of handwritten notes, copies of emails Mark thought he'd deleted, and a detailed log of every time he'd forced her to forge my signature on documents. She hadn't come forward sooner because she was terrified of the associates Mark worked with, but now that they were all in jail or on the run, she felt safe enough to talk. That box was the final nail in the coffin of Mark's mastermind theory. It proved, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that he had been the one pulling the strings and that I was entirely innocent. When that evidence was presented in court, the judge actually apologized to me. Mark's lawyers tried to object, but the evidence was overwhelming. The defense collapsed in a matter of hours. I remember sitting in the gallery, watching Mark as the reality of his situation finally, truly sank in. He wasn't going to be the victim. He wasn't going to take me down with him. He was just a small, greedy man who had tried to play a game he wasn't smart enough to win. The trial ended shortly after that, with a guilty verdict on every single count. The sentencing hearing was a quiet, somber affair, devoid of the media circus that had characterized the trial. The courtroom was mostly empty, save for a few reporters and the families of the other men Mark had helped put behind bars. I sat in the front row, wearing a simple navy blue suit, feeling a strange sense of detachment. It felt like I was watching a movie about someone else's life. Mark was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands and feet shackled. He looked older, his skin sallow and his eyes sunken. He didn't look at me once. The judge didn't hold back. He spoke for nearly 20 minutes about the breathtaking arrogance and systemic greed that Mark had displayed. He talked about the lives he'd impacted, the city workers whose pensions were at risk, the taxpayers who had been defrauded, and the wife he had tried to frame for his own crimes. When he finally announced the sentence, 25 years in a federal penitentiary with no possibility of parole, a small, sharp gasp escaped my throat. It was more than I'd expected, a virtual life sentence for a man in his late 40s. As they led him away, Mark finally turned his head. Our eyes met for just a second, and in that moment, I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. I just felt a profound sense of waste. 12 years of my life gone. All those memories, all those plans for the future, all incinerated by one man's bottomless ego. I walked out of the courthouse and into a pouring rainstorm, standing there for a long time, letting the water soak through my clothes, feeling the weight of the last year finally starting to lift. It was over. Truly, finally over. The aftermath was a slow process of reclamation. I had to sell what little was left of my business assets to pay off the remaining legal fees. I moved into an even smaller apartment, one that looked nothing like the curated home I'd once lived in. It was a fixer-upper in a neighborhood that was still on the way up, filled with mismatched furniture and boxes that I didn't have the energy to unpack for months. But it was mine. Every square inch of it was paid for with honest work. I spent my evenings painting the walls, sanding the floors, and slowly turning the space into a sanctuary. I started taking on small design projects again, consultations for local businesses, helping young couples decorate their first homes on a budget. It was a far cry from the high-end residential work I'd done before, but it was incredibly fulfilling. I was helping real people create real homes, and for the first time, I felt like my work actually mattered. I wasn't just creating a backdrop for a fake life. I was helping people build a foundation for their real ones. My reputation started to heal, not as the scorned wife, but as the resilient designer who had survived the unthinkable. One afternoon, about a year after the sentencing, I received a letter from the prison. It was from Mark. I stared at the envelope for a long time, the return address a stark reminder of where he was. Part of me wanted to burn it without opening it, to maintain the silence I'd cultivated so carefully. But another part of me, the part that still sought closure, needed to know what he had to say. I opened it with shaking hands. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It was a single sheet of paper with one sentence written in his familiar, sharp handwriting. I hoped the house was worth it. I laughed. I actually laughed out loud, the sound echoing in my small, unfinished kitchen. He still didn't get it. He still thought it was about the things. He still thought I'd ruined him because I wanted the house, or the money, or the status. He couldn't conceive of a world where someone would choose truth over comfort or integrity over wealth. I took the letter, walked over to the small fireplace I'd just restored, and watched it turn to ash. That was the last time I ever thought about what Mark wanted or thought. He was a ghost, a remnant of a life that no longer existed. Life continued in its quiet, steady way. I made new friends, people who didn't know about the scandal or the trial. I started dating again, cautiously, with a man named David who was a high school teacher and had a laugh that made me feel like I was 19 again. He was the complete opposite of Mark, honest to a fault, grounded, and completely unimpressed by status or wealth. When I eventually told him about my past, he didn't look at me with pity. He just took my hand and said, "You must be incredibly strong." It was the first time I realized that I was. The ruined part of the story eventually became a badge of honor. I started giving talks at local business seminars about financial ethics and the importance of due diligence in personal and professional relationships. I used my experience to help other women recognize the signs of financial abuse and how to protect themselves. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was an advocate. The story that Mark thought would destroy me had become the foundation of a new, much more meaningful life. I had lost the mansion, the Tesla, and the Amalfi Coast trips, but I had gained my soul. One Saturday morning, I was at a local farmer's market, buying fresh flowers for a client's new office. The sun was warm on my back, the air was filled with the scent of fresh bread and lavender, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of peace. I thought about the woman I'd been 2 years ago, sitting on that bed with the burner phone, terrified of the future. I wished I could go back and tell her that it was going to be okay, that the ruining was actually a clearing, a forest fire that had to happen so new growth could emerge. As I walked back to my car, I saw a woman I used to know from my old life. She was getting into a brand new SUV, her designer bag swinging from her arm, her face tight, with a familiar kind of stress. She saw me and paused, her eyes taking in my simple sundress and my used sedan. For a second, I saw a flicker of something in her expression, not pity, but envy. She was still living in the curated world, still playing the part, still wondering if the person she was sleeping next to was telling her the truth. I smiled at her, a genuine, warm smile, and drove away. The final closure came when the house, our old house, was finally sold at auction. It had been tied up in legal proceedings for years, sitting empty and neglected. I decided to drive by it one last time. It looked smaller than I remembered, the once manicured lawn overgrown with weeds, the windows dark and dusty. It wasn't a palace anymore. It was just a building full of ghosts and lies. I didn't even get out of the car. I just looked at it for a moment, acknowledged the years I'd spent there, and then I turned the corner and didn't look back. People still talk, of course. In a city like Raleigh, a scandal like that has a long tail. Sometimes I'll be at a restaurant and I'll catch someone whispering and pointing, and I know they're saying, "That's her. That's the woman who ruined her husband." I used to let it bother me, used to feel the need to explain, to defend myself. Now, I just take a sip of my wine and enjoy the company of the people I'm with. Their opinions don't define me. Mark's crimes don't define me. I am the architect of my own life now, and the structure I've built is solid, honest, and entirely mine. I heard recently that Mark is spending his time in prison trying to appeal his sentence, still filing motions, still trying to blame everyone but himself. He's become a jailhouse lawyer, obsessed with the minutiae of the law, still trying to find a loophole that will let him back into a world that has long since moved on without him. It's a fitting end for him, really. He's trapped in a cage of his own making, both literally and figuratively, while I am finally, truly free. I think about that burner phone sometimes. I think about the moment I decided to open it instead of putting it back in the book. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, and the most important. It was the moment I stopped being a supporting character in someone else's dark fantasy and became the protagonist of my own reality. Mark thinks I ruined his life, and in a way, I did. I ruined the lie he was living. I ruined the facade he was hiding behind. But more importantly, I saved mine. And if I had to do it all over again, knowing everything I know now, I wouldn't change a single thing. The most satisfying part isn't seeing him in orange, it's the silence. The absence of the constant, low-level anxiety that I didn't even realize I had. The peace of knowing that when I go to sleep at night, there are no hidden phones, no shell companies, and no secrets waiting to explode. My life is small, and sometimes it's a struggle, but it's real. And in the end, that's more than Mark ever had, even when he had everything. He's still Mark the mastermind in his own head, but to the rest of the world, he's just an inmate number. And me? I'm just a woman who decided she'd had enough of the lies. And that is a story I'm more than happy to tell.